So at work, I spend a lot of time looking at logs, which means I spend a lot of time looking at JSON or JavaScript object notation payloads. And JSON is not the easiest thing to parse as a human, so I wanted to create a small interactive application that made it a little bit easier for me to look at JSON payloads, especially particularly large and nested JSON payloads. So the idea is I would come in here, paste in my JSON from my log file, hit Command Enter, or I could just hit Explore, and this JSON string now gets parsed into this data structure, which is being rendered as a tree in the DOM here. And you can see that it's a structure and it has keys, and some of those keys are numbers and nulls and booleans and strings and so on and so forth. You can see I have an array here. The array has structures in and of itself. And one of the things that I particularly wanted to do was be able to see this kind of nested string and then parse it on the fly into JSON. So if I hold down my meta key or my command key and I click on this, what you'll see is that string was parsed into a JSON object, and then that parsed into a native JavaScript object, and then that object was rendered as part of this tree. Now, another thing that I want to do is be able to remove some of the noise. So for example, let's say that this giant structure here isn't really something that I want to concentrate on, it's getting in the way, so I just click on the key and you'll see that it collapses down. And now it's a little bit easier for me to see the keys around it, right? I could start to collapse more and more. And then I could open those things up again. And then you can collapse anything. You can collapse structures of the headers. You can do individual items. You can do values here. So if this string was starting to get very long, for example, I could remove that. And what this is also trying to do is take this JavaScript object, this JSON payload, and stuff it into the URL. You can't see the URL in this particular video capture, but for example, let me just make this smaller, and now if I hit Alt-Enter, you'll see this opens up in a new browser, and you can see immediately I have the same object there. So the idea here is I'd be able to take this URL and paste it to one of my teammates, and we'd both be looking at the same JavaScript object notation payload. So let's take a quick look at how this is working, because it started out as a fun code kata around Angular, and I think it kind of accidentally developed into something I really want to use. So essentially what it does is it parses that JSON payload and it passes it into this JSON tree. JSON tree does absolutely nothing except kick off a recursive rendering of JSON node. So if we look at the JSON node, we can see that it takes a value, and what JSON node is going to do is start rendering that data structure recursively using other JSON node instances. So if we look at our JSON node component HTML page, what we can see is we're switching on a particular data type. So for example, here's null and string, and these are all basically the same here. It's just a label and a value template. You can see I have a lot of conditional rendering using ng switch case, using ng if, there's some ng repeats. But really what I want to do is jump down to the array and the object cases. So for the array, what you'll see is that I'm using the ng-for directive to iterate over the value, right? The value is an array, so in this case I'm iterating over the indices in that array. And for each value, I'm creating a recursive JSON node call, and I'm passing in the array item to that JSON node. So this array is going to be rendered recursively using JSON node for each one of the items within that array. Similarly, when we look at the object, we can see I'm using the key value pipe here to iterate over the values in the object, and just as with the array, I'm using the JSON node component to recursively render that object out using the sub value here, which is the iteration value. So simple values are essentially the end of the recursive loop, right? They just render as is, they just basically render their own value. But the more complex objects of arrays and object type, again, I'm iterating over the keys and the indices within those objects, and then recursively calling JSON node component to render the sub value contained within those complex values. And again, this started out as a code kata, but will, I think, actually be something that I want to use pasting JSON payloads into this. One other thing to notice, let me just go back to my original data structure here, is that this label and value layout is done using CSS Grid, which is why when I collapse the value here, what you'll notice is that these structures lower down don't just kind of collapse up to the right of these values, which is something that might happen if you were using floats. It could also happen even with a flexbox, depending on how you have some of your flex settings. But that's what's really nice about the CSS Grid layout, is that I don't have to worry about that because this is a 2-column layout, and CSS Grid maintains that column structure even when not all of the quote-unquote cells are being rendered within a particular row. So this is actually one of my first times actually using CSS Grid in a way that I felt like I had to, and I think it worked quite nicely. So anyway, this was a fun exploration. It turned into something I think I may actually use, and maybe anyone else will find it interesting. If nothing else, it's a fun look at recursive rendering in an Angular app.